Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Kościuszko Foundation's webinar, Prometheism and Power, Mobilizing Nationalism to Confront the Russian Empire. My name is Ewa Zadworna. I'm Vice President and Director of Cultural Affairs at the Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome our guest speakers who have joined us here today for this panel discussion, namely Dr. Olga Avdeyeva of Loyola University, Dr. Marcel Garboś of the University of Aberdeen, and Dr. Maciej Olchawa, Kościuszko Foundation Scholar at Loyola University, Chicago. I also welcome everyone in attendance. Thank you all very much for taking time out from your busy schedule and accepting our invitation to join us here on Zoom. The Kościuszko Foundation's primary role is to award grants, fellowships, and scholarships. Also, our role is to promote knowledge and better understanding about Poland and Poland-related matters. Knowing scholars who happen to be Kościuszko Foundation scholars makes it easy for us to combine these two parts of the Foundation's mission because we know who knows about the things that we and you, our dear viewers, would like to know. And we know that Dr. Maciej Olchawa knows a lot about Poland, its geopolitics, its past and present. He studied it, first at Loyola University, Chicago, where he received a bachelor degree in history and international studies, and then at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, Poland, where he obtained master's degree in Central and Eastern European studies and Ukrainian studies, and where later on he earned his Ph.D. in political studies. Dr. Olchawa served as a policy advisor on Ukraine in various bodies and institutions of the European Union. He's the author of a number of scholarly books and articles that have appeared in academic journals, and currently he teaches about Polish and Eastern European politics at Loyola University as the Kościuszko Foundation Scholar. Dr. Olchawa shares his knowledge also with audiences outside of the university campus, using a variety of platforms, Kościuszko Foundation Zoom webinar including. And with that, I would like to turn this virtual podium over to him. Maciej, thank you very much.
Eva, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion titled Prometheism and Power, Mobilizing Nationalism to Confront the Russian Empire. My name is Maciej Olchawa, and I am the Kościuszko Foundation Scholar at Loyola University, Chicago. Over the past 2 years, I've had the privilege and honor to teach various political science courses at LUC that focused on Poland and Ukraine. I'm very happy to be part of this wonderful initiative offered by the College of Arts and Sciences. This initiative is sponsored by the Kościuszko Foundation from the Loyola University Chicago Polish Studies Fund, established thanks to the generosity of Bożena and John McLeese and Professor John Kulczycki. I'm very thankful to these individuals and also grateful for the support of Professor Alex Grigorescu and Professor Molly Mellon from Loyola's Department of Political Science. As a former student of Loyola, I'm really proud that it has become a powerhouse in Polish studies. Thanks to the leadership of Professor Bożena and McLeese and the hard work of the program's professors, students can take classes in Polish history, literature, and film, and study the language. I strongly encourage parents and future students to consider Loyola as the university that offers a minor in Polish studies. I'd also like to thank Marek Skulimowski, President and Executive Director of the Kościuszko Foundation, for making today's panel possible. We are also grateful to Ewa Zadworna, the Kościuszko Foundation's Vice President and Director of Cultural Affairs, for her kind help in organizing and promoting this webinar. I am joined today by Dr. Olga Avdeyeva, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science at Loyola University, Chicago. Olga's research focuses on international influences on national policy and gender equality. Her most recent article in Post-Soviet Affairs looks at the ethnic identity bias in the context of the dominant party authoritarian electoral system in Russia's multi-ethnic republics. Here with us is also Dr. Marcel Garboś, who is a historian of social and political thought in the late Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Marcel specializes in the comparative history of empires and visions of post-imperial order in the modern world. He is starting a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Aberdeen. Thank you, Olga and Marcel, for taking part in this panel discussion. It is absolutely wonderful to see you. Today, we will be discussing the concept of Prometheism in the context of the Soviet and Russian Empire. Although many of our viewers may be experts in this field and are familiar with Prometheism, we are also joined today by many students who are just beginning their academic journey into Central and Eastern Europe. From what they've told me in the classroom, the Russo-Ukrainian War has sparked their interest in the region. Many are also impressed with the support that Poland has given to Ukraine. Indeed, it is very heartening that thousands of Polish families welcomed Ukrainians into their homes during the first days and months following the full-scale invasion that began almost 2 years ago. Poland has also given weapons to aid Ukraine's war effort and convinced other states to do the same. Many of us are convinced that Poland is doing the right thing and that this policy is both strategically and morally correct. It's almost as if this course of action for Poland is the only viable choice, and it's because it's a member of the European Union and NATO. But was this Poland's only option? What about Hungary? Hungary is also Ukraine's neighbor and is a member of the EU and NATO. And yet, under Viktor Orban, it has shaped its foreign policy toward Russia in a way that is very different from Poland's support for Ukraine and Warsaw's attitude toward Moscow. Part of the reason for this may be found in a political doctrine that took shape during the Cold War and has its roots even before the Second World War. Why did Poland choose to support the independence of its neighbors and not simply deal over their heads with the Kremlin? How did Poland benefit from this? One answer is provided by the historian Timothy Snyder. In my course on politics and nationalism, this semester students are reading his book, The Reconstruction of Nations. In it, Snyder states that although Poland regained sovereignty in 1989, it was the country's accession to NATO in 1999 that suggests the end of a stage of national history. Snyder writes that NATO membership confirmed the success of the modern Polish nation state and rewarded Poland's handling of the sensitive national questions. I can quote Snyder. He writes, "In supporting the new nation state between itself and Russia, Poland succeeded in defining itself as part of the West." But how did Poland do this? Or more importantly, why? This is where Prometheism comes in. And I'm delighted that Dr. Garboś will give us the background of this doctrine and its origins. Before we get to that, I would like to make a few remarks about what has been called neo-Prometheism. Today, when we look at Poland's Eastern policy, it may seem so straightforward and obvious from a geopolitical perspective that we often don't stop to think about its roots. But it's quite remarkable that since 1989, there has been an overwhelming consensus among various Polish governments from across the political spectrum that it is in Poland's interest to integrate states of the former Soviet Empire into the Euro-Atlantic community. This continuity can be traced back to neo-Prometheism, articulated by Jerzy Giedroyć, editor of the influential Paris-based periodical titled Kultura. At heart, this doctrine, which became Poland's Eastern grand strategy, is anti-imperial. Following World War II, when Poland became a Soviet satellite and lost its territories in the east. Giedroyć and his colleague Juliusz Mieroszewski articulated the concept that the post-war borders should not be reversed, and that a sovereign Poland would need to support an independent Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, which they abbreviated as ULB. This was seen as very controversial among many Polish émigrés who did not accept the borders imposed by the Yalta Agreement of 1945. Giedroyć and Mieroszewski were ahead of their time, thinking about the fall of the Soviet Union and Poland's security following the USSR's collapse. It should be noted that neo-Prometheism, or New Prometheism, has also been called the Giedroyć doctrine. Its main principles were anti-imperialism and anti-communism. According to this doctrine, the territories between the eastern border of Poland and Russia have historically been a zone of rivalry for dominance in the region. Thus, the doctrine is in essence about relations between Poland and Russia. It draws a correlation between the independence and self-determination of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania, and the independence and security of Poland. A central question to this doctrine was whether the ULB states would become independent or would they continue to be peripheries of a Russian empire. The Giedroyć doctrine holds that the freedom of those nations safeguards Poland from Russian imperialism, and for that reason, Poland has to support them. It is a doctrine grounded in both romanticism and realism at the same time. At its core is national interest. This doctrine was developed during the Cold War as an intellectual exercise to answer the question, what should Poland's Eastern policy be following the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union? The brilliance and prescience of what Giedroyć and Mieroszewski were proposing was that they were writing at a time when the end of the USSR was nowhere in sight. Mieroszewski was writing in the early 1970s, and it would take almost 2 more decades before the Soviet Union collapsed. The idea that Poles need to support the independence of its neighbors was also pursued by émigrés in the United States. Giedroyć kept in contact with many of them, including Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was President Carter's national security advisor. For this reason, I would like to briefly turn our attention to the US and note that after World War II, the influx of displaced persons, Central and Eastern Europeans who did not want to return to communist states, had a considerable effect on the makeup of the Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian communities in the United States. Like Jerzy Giedroyć, many of these new immigrants had political, military, and diplomatic experience and would use it to partake in the discussions on American foreign policy toward the Soviet Union. They became part and very active in anti-communist organizations, whose purpose was to remind the public about the enslavement of nations by communism and lobby the American government to not let its guard down when dealing with the Kremlin. I'll end with a short digression that references the symbolism of the Titan Prometheus, who epitomizes defiance and rebellion against tyranny. Let me share my screen with you for a second. You know, this is, here you have the photo of the Taras Shevchenko monument in Washington, D.C., dedicated to Ukraine's national poet. There in the background, which I'll show you in the next picture, is Prometheus in chains. Right here. And to give you a little background of the story to that, on June 27th, 1964, around 40,000 Ukrainian Americans marched from the Lincoln Monument to the Triangular Park on 23rd and P Street, where the Bard statue was unveiled. Former President Eisenhower addressed them from beneath Shevchenko's monument. And he said, "You have come here by the thousands to honor the memory of a poet who expressed so eloquently man's undying determination to fight for freedom and his unquenched faith in ultimate victory." The inscription on the side of the monument's granite wall reads, "Dedicated to the liberation, freedom, and independence of all captive nations." Words carefully crafted to ensure that representatives of the Soviet delegation would not come to the memorial's unveiling. When I worked in DC, I used to live 2 blocks away from the Shevchenko Memorial. I passed by it almost every day, and when reading the words from the poem The Caucasus by Shevchenko, I thought how patient and determined the émigrés had to be to keep hope that the captive nations would one day be free. I think that is a lesson that we may want to draw from Prometheism when we think about Russia's war and occupation of Crimea and other territories that belong to Ukraine. Now I would like to turn to Marcel and kindly ask him to provide us with more context on the roots of Prometheism. Obviously, this doctrine in its various shapes and forms had to put Poland on a crash course with Russia. Can you tell us more about that? This will lead us into Dr. Olga Avdeyeva's presentation, which will reveal how Putin's regime reacts to efforts at mobilizing nationalism in the post-Soviet states, and also various criticisms, theoretical criticisms of the doctrine of Prometheism.
Well, thank you, Maciej, for the introduction. And I should also mention very briefly that I was glad to hear that you're still teaching Timothy Snyder's book, because around 15 years ago, that was probably the first text that I really picked up that got me interested in Polish Eastern policy and transnational history. So that, of course, informs my approach to Prometheism as well, which has grown from being mainly focused on the Baltic and Black Sea region to really being more broadly Eurasian. So I'm going to try to share my screen just for a moment so that all of you can check out this map that I put together a while back. And this is really part of my response to the question of defining, the problem of defining what Prometheism was. I think that Maciej gave an excellent overview of the ideas in terms of Polish doctrine, geopolitically, of mobilizing the different borderlands of what used to be the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Where it becomes a bit more difficult to define Prometheism exactly is that it was so multifocal as a movement in the interwar period. Even though a lot of its material sponsorship and its organizational underpinnings came from the Polish military intelligence staff, really with their headquarters in Warsaw, Prometheism was spread all over Eurasia and really operated at the margins of the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. And as Maciej also alluded, these networks were reconfigured pretty radically by World War II, and then oftentimes transplanted to the English-speaking world, where Promethean activists and thinkers continued to push for a more aggressive policy toward the Soviet Union. Prometheism, in this sense, is at its core organized around the idea that the different borderlands of the former Russian imperial space should organize themselves together and cooperate. But this movement was also ideologically multifocal too. The Prometheans, for instance, who were in Paris, some of the Ukrainian activists, the Georgians as well, the Azeris, could be anywhere from national liberals to moderate social democrats. Whereas in Warsaw, especially in the 30s, Prometheism became increasingly aligned with more right-wing ideas about nationalism. And although I wouldn't say it became at all a fascist movement, there was definitely interest in Hitler's National Socialist doctrine and also in Japanese Pan-Asianism at that time. So if you want to return to this map later, we can do that. But this just is to give a quick overview of where those different nodes were in this network of Promethean thinkers. So again, here you have Warsaw kind of at the center in the 20s and 30s, but also Paris, Helsinki, where there were Pan-Finnic activists who wanted to incorporate parts of Karelia and Ingria, sort of the very northwestern areas of what's now the Russian Federation, into Finland. And then also, of course, there were Poles and Ukrainians in the diaspora in Harbin, in what's now northeastern China, and in the 30s, which came under Japanese control. So Prometheism in that sense was multifocal, and the idea was polysemic. But we can nevertheless try to identify some more general characteristics of what people were thinking in the 20s and 30s, regardless of where they were within this network. Just to preface that, though, I want to show you very quickly just these two maps of the world in the 20th century. The first one from the eve of World War I, which is when some of the early roots of Prometheism were developing in the camp of Józef Piłsudski and his wing of the Polish Socialist Party. And then if we jump to today, of course, we see a world in which the empires have largely cleaved into smaller national units. What this map doesn't exactly capture, or this pair of maps doesn't capture, but which is really important for Prometheism, is that even as these individual nation states were emerging throughout the 20th century, many of their leaders, including Piłsudski and interwar Poland, believed it was necessary for internationalist collaboration against the former imperial centers to take hold in order for these new states to survive. You see this, for instance, after World War II and in the Cold War with the non-aligned movement, which organized many countries of the global South within a very loose program of economic and political cooperation to prevent neocolonialism on the part of the Western European and North American powers from resurging. We can see Prometheism really as part of this bigger genre, though, and specifically Prometheism is aimed at the borderlands of the former Russian Empire and Soviet Union. The Prometheans thought of themselves actually as a kind of internationalist movement opposed to the Communist International and also the ethno-federal system of the Soviet Union. Both of those, the Prometheans from the 20s onward, decried as just extensions of Muscovite or Russian imperialism, and argued really that the key to securing the existence of all of these individual national states that would theoretically emerge from the ruins of the Soviet Union could only come if the territory of Russia were really restricted to a small area around Moscow. And I'll show you that map very quickly here. If I had to give you a definition of what Prometheism was in the 20s and 30s, I would show you this map, which circulated in the 1930s in the Promethean journals that at the time were being published in Warsaw, Paris, and then circulating even further afield in places like Helsinki, Harbin, Istanbul, and even Tehran. So really all around Eurasia. At the core of this map, you can see the distinction between these darker areas, these territories that ethnographically were non-Russian and historically had been part of the Russian Empire before 1917, and which continued to be part of the Soviet Union after its formation in 1922. The idea here that was shared by the Polish military intelligence staff and also the Promethean exiles was that these states can only survive by fragmenting the Soviet Union along national lines. And it's interesting, for today's purposes, when we talk about national or transnational cooperation, that for many of the Prometheans, the nation state or the independent kind of national unit wasn't the endpoint of this process. The Promethean exiles from the Caucasus, so meaning the North Caucasus, for instance, present-day Chechnya, Dagestan, the South Caucasus as well, Georgia, Azerbaijan. The Armenians didn't really join the movement because it had partly pan-Turkic overtones. They all believed that it was necessary to organize a Caucasian confederation. And many of these other Promethean exiles from Central Asia, the Volga region, and even Ukraine argued that in the event of a Soviet collapse, it would be necessary for these different states to form a confederation, at least to organize their military affairs, and maybe even to enter into something more in the sense of a trade bloc or some political union. What we also see illustrated in this map is that the Promethean movement distinguished between the areas of European Russia, which were labeled as Rossia in the sort of left-hand side of this map, that had been part of the early modern Muscovite state since the 15th and 16th centuries. And then other areas like Siberia and the Far East with large ethnically Russian populations that they nevertheless considered to be distinct from the Muscovite core. And the Prometheans, specifically thinkers like Włodzimierz Bączkowski, who himself came from near Lake Baikal and actually studied in Manchuria before moving to Poland in the 1920s. They argued that Siberia was a distinct territory from the rest of Russia, and that the ethnic Russians there, by virtue of having emigrated from European Russia over the course of a few centuries, had their own distinctive identity and could create what they saw as a United States of Siberia. And Bączkowski even wrote in the 30s in Polish that Siberia czeka swego Waszyngtona, that Siberia is waiting for its own Washington. So in this sense, Prometheism was not just about encouraging ethnic or national separatism, but it also consisted to a great degree of encouraging regional separation from the control of Moscow at this point. And this is significant, of course, because Prometheism was articulated as a response to the Soviet policy of centralizing really control over all of these territories. Although the Soviet Union, and then of course its biggest successor state, the Russian Federation, have officially been federal systems in terms of their outward trappings, we know that at their core, these states are much more centralized in terms of where military, political, and economic decision-making are concentrated. So this was really intended as a radical alternative to that Soviet model. And I would add to this that the Promethean Poles in Vilnius or in Warsaw between the wars were looking eastward, and they were thinking about Poland's mission of liberating the different nationalities, different regions of this big Eurasian space. And they argued in the spirit of Józef Piłsudski and his circle of Polish Prometheans that Poland historically, throughout the 19th century, and even going back to the time of the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century, had always been this kind of counterweight to the Muscovite territories or the Muscovite heartlands of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union. And that historically there had been a struggle over the borderlands, primarily the Baltic region, Belarus, Ukraine, and those areas between the Baltic and Black Seas, but more broadly into the Eurasian steppe and even parts of Siberia and the Far East. So the Prometheans, in this sense, drew upon this legacy of Polish messianism and romantic nationalism to formulate this very capacious idea of a Polish-led movement to liberate the borderlands. And I would say the other way that we can think of this too, if we use the Russian nomenclature, beginning in the 18th, but especially 19th centuries, there's a distinction in Russian geographical discourse between the Ukraini, or Kresy as you might call them, the borderlands, and the Centr, or what would be called Karenная Россия, Centralnaya Россia. And the Russian distinction also was, in a broad sense, between the territories around Moscow being the center and the non-Russian regions being the borderlands. So the Prometheans really did also draw upon this geographical imaginary as well. Now, Promethean ideas, as what we'll probably talk about more in the question and answer session, outlived this Promethean movement that formerly existed in the 1920s and 1930s. And we perhaps see this most clearly in May of 2022, when the so-called Free Nations of Post-Russia movement developed among anti-Putin exiles. Their first gathering was actually in Warsaw, interestingly enough, sort of following in the footsteps of interwar Prometheism. And the post-Russia movement published this map on Twitter, and it's since circulated around the internet, calling for a relatively comparable destruction of the Russian Federation's unity and the reorganization of the Russian Federation into this big Eurasian patchwork of independent nations and regions. And some of the units, of course, overlap with the Promethean ideas, in the Caucasus, for instance, or in Siberia. But these thinkers go even further than that. And one of the Polish members of this movement, Janusz Bugajski, again, a Polish British historian and scholar, has argued that this vision of post-Russia is not just anti-colonial, but also neo-Promethean. So even though no state has officially espoused this vision of disassembling Russia in the event of Putin's collapse, the Promethean ideas that were circulating in the 20s and 30s actually continued throughout the 20th century. And are still emerging today and re-emerging in this discussion. So I would just finish up in the last couple of minutes, because I am getting up on 15 minutes, to talk maybe about the practical implementation of Prometheism. So you saw in this map from 1931, this broad messianic vision of Poland leading the way in breaking up the Soviet Union. The idea of Poland as a rival to the Muscovite territories in the struggle for the post-imperial territory. Prometheism as a political doctrine, though, changed considerably from the early 20th century to World War II. In the beginning, if we think about Józef Piłsudski and his circle of Polish revolutionaries, really in the 1890s, going up to the revolution of 1905 in Russia, Piłsudski, believe it or not, for all of his reputation as a military man and really a strong man in interwar Poland, he was originally, in his younger years, a socialist. And he believed that Poland, as the most industrialized part of the Russian Empire, actually held a kind of obligation to become the leading force behind a socialist movement to break up Russia. A socialist movement specifically that would combine class struggle and national emancipation, and that would break away the different borderlands from the control of St. Petersburg and what he considered to be the Muscovite heartlands. Now, Piłsudski's revolutionary vision changed into one that emphasized much more in the way of discipline and regimentation and military organization after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, and also after the Balkan Wars, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire by Bulgaria, especially Serbia, and these other Balkan countries. Piłsudski believed that the only way to actually organize Prometheism was to do it through military channels and to have a Polish officer corps that would be capable of leading an armed struggle against the Russian state. Piłsudski also, going into World War I, sided originally with the Austrian Empire against Russia. But once an independent Polish state emerged after 1918, Piłsudski was in charge of both the military and the government. And his policy towards the eastern borderlands of Poland, Belarus and Ukraine in particular, really was quite heavy-handed. Piłsudski really did prioritize Polish geopolitical needs over the self-determination of the peoples in these regions, and used military force to put down the Western Ukrainian and Lithuanian opposition to Poland. And this, of course, earned criticism from some future Prometheans who argued that Poland actually should encourage the development of Ukrainian and Belarusian nationalism within its borders in order to project that across the frontier into the Soviet Union. And this became a major motif in Promethean thought in the 20s and 30s about actually encouraging these national movements within Poland's borders without destabilizing the borderlands far too much. And I would say that the Prometheans in the 20s and 30s in Poland came up with some really ambitious ideas for devolving political power, economic authority as well to autonomous Belarusian and Ukrainian territories. But at the end of the day, really the interests of the state prevailed. And these programs of autonomy only were implemented on a quite limited basis. And just to wrap that up, I would say to really echo the words of Jan Jacek Bruski, a Polish historian, that Prometheism in the 20s and 30s might be considered more of a defensive posture than an offensive one. Because by 1939, it was actually pro-Soviet peasant militias and communist parties that had a very strong presence on the ground in Volhynia and Western Belarus. While the Prometheans had their global network, and these ideas were circulating, of course, but they made relatively limited progress in terms of digging their way into the Western borderlands of the Soviet Union. Thanks, everyone, for that. I'm happy to pick up on that more in the question and answer session, and I'm happy also to talk about the Cold War continuities of the Promethean ideas of weaponized nationalism, if you'd like to. So thank you for that.
Marcel, thank you so much for that wonderful summary of Prometheism, its roots, and how it changed in the early 20th century. I do want to add that the Q&A chat is open. I would highly encourage everyone who has questions to put their question inside the Q&A, and especially the students that are joining us from Loyola or other parts of the U.S. or the world. Strongly encourage questions that we'll get to in the Q&A. So please do that. Olga, when Marcel's very good summary of the ideology, the intellectual side of Prometheism, but also the practical of what that movement, what that doctrine might actually mean for whether it's the Soviet Empire or now the Russian Empire. He referenced Janusz Bugajski, who talks about the rupture of Russia very often. And it is this that I wanted, if you could please give us more background on what was the Russians' response to this. Obviously, this is not a doctrine that the Kremlin would believe went along with its interests. So what was and what is the reaction of Moscow to these principles of Prometheism, and also what are some criticisms, some theoretical criticisms of this movement?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this interesting discussion. Actually, I did not know about the Polish theory on Prometheism until I joined this discussion and preparation, obviously, for this discussion. I will offer some of my I would start with very basic ideas on how this has developed. Obviously, the Russian Empire already knew that sparkling nationalism in different borderlands of all the big empires was one of the techniques to start the competition between the empires. This was a very well-known strategy of emancipation of different minorities. And it was especially used very effectively against the Ottoman Empire. And unfortunately, it also led to very tragic events, including the genocide of the Armenian people as one of the pinnacles, not necessarily of the Prometheism itself. Obviously, I do not want to imply that, but sparkling nationalism as part of imperial fight against each other at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. We know that all of these events of imperial competition led to the First World War and later to the Second World War. When the Soviet Union was created in 1921, the understanding that nationalism is the biggest problem and is the biggest challenge to accommodate in all the different ethnic groups is the most important thing. Stalin was the secretary of nationalities within the Soviet Union Communist Party. He, together with Lenin, put together the response of how we are going to redesign the Russian Empire now within the Soviet Union and introduce the safeguards on secessionist and movements. So first of all, their response was to empower local elites, regional elites, ethnic elites, and each big group, not all of the ethnic groups, but most of the ethnic large groups received their territory and received their instruments for governing over these territories under the, of course, observation and control of the Communist Party. So yes, it was a centralized state, but essentially they have created the opportunity for what they call the Hellenization of power, which meant the essentially bringing the ethnic communist leadership so that they be interested in maintaining the control over their territories within the larger union. And another big aspect, so it's first incorporating the ethnic elite into the leadership. That came also with mass education, and mass education has provided a very important foundation for developing a new citizenship, a new identity, which meant that now people could be taught that they're not ethnic, like Buryats, Tajik, but they are Soviet people. So it's an idea of creating a universal, ideologically motivated person whose main identity transcends the ethnic or religious lines, cultural lines, but their main identity is Soviet and communist. It's ideological. So that, of course, was maintained and for the period of the Soviet time, and I don't want to go in depth of how it has changed over time. The Soviet doctrine did allow the use of language in most of the territories, so the titular languages were taught in school, but all of the citizens should have spoken Russian. So Russification became as one of the foundations of the cultural kind of glue that brought everything together, but it didn't highlight that it was Russian. What the main focus was that it was Soviet, communist, ideological, and we speak one language. So that's the sort of the basic idea behind the Soviet time. Now the Soviet Union collapses. And here where I wanted to emphasize the sort of structural foundations of how the Soviet Union was able to collapse with all the ethnic groups, at least in the Soviet Union republics, sort of seceding without much opposition of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Union leadership. So there are some structural conditions that enable such a peaceful, more or less peaceful secession at the time. We know that Gorbachev sent tanks in Vilnius, 15 people died, but after this happened, he really stopped the use of force or the threat of the use of force, and therefore the secession has occurred. Here we need to understand, like, I'm a political scientist and I believe in elites seeking power and the economic structures of a communist state or post-communist state at that time, but still with state-planned economy allowed this secession. So what we observed there is that each republic had a layer of elites that most of them were ethnic elites who could easily control the economic assets and all of the assets, including land, in their territories, because there was no private property, or essentially formally, nobody could claim right over it. So that fact allowed this secession to occur without much contestation from other people who be claiming property from, let's say, other parts of the Soviet Union. Therefore, and the elites were very, in all of these republics, were essentially very interested in maintaining or in facilitating the collapse, because then they would automatically be in charge. If they are the state and the state owns everything, they get an automatic ownership of everything that stays within their territories. So therefore, all other safeguards that were thought through in the Soviet Empire at the time about how to keep them all together essentially didn't play a role. But this one, which was highly overlooked by the Soviet elites, essentially was the most important one that motivated the secession. And we know that the secession occurred not because the Baltic republics walked away, but because the Russian Federation was the first one to announce its independence on June 12, 1991. So, and if the biggest federation steps out, obviously everybody gets the red flag to follow the suit. What does the Russian response, now that we're looking at the today's response of the Russian elites to that? Obviously, they figure out that this is how it works, and therefore the main thing to prevent this to happen is to make sure that elites in each ethnic republic, but also in all other regions, would have access to assets all around Russia, which they would lose automatically if they allow secession of their republics. So that's why they make sure that all ethnic elites, the big clans, and most of these societies, I mean, I must say that Russia still has a lot of feudalism in its kind of governance structure. So it's all patron and client relations. And these patron and client relations are even more pronounced in ethnic republics. So therefore, what happens is that informal but also formal connections to property mean a lot, which means that now the official policy and, well, maybe not official policy, but there was we see a lot of state effort to allow clans, big clans from elite clans from different republics have access to property, even in the new territories. If you read like who got developmental programs in Mariupol, and in many of you see the Chechen clans, the Tatar clans. So why is it done? So that they would lose all of this automatically if their republics would choose to go. So essentially, the belief is that the people would follow the elites, and if the elites will be interested in maintaining the centralizing state, that therefore they'll be able to control their populations. Even those protests that we see right now, some protests do have a kind of one of the themes of being sort of ethnic emancipation or protest against the war, like we have seen recently in Bashkortostan. One of the main still arguments there, at least how it is, the understanding of where the conflict really arose. It's not only about Bashkortostani people trying to, serving in the war, participating in large numbers in the war. Even if they have incorporated, the leaders of this conflict incorporated that criticism as one of their points. But the biggest conflict still arose around what they call ecological claim, is that essentially pastures being ruined by the mines, and mines are being controlled by not somebody else's, but actually by ethnically Bashkortostani elites. So therefore, it's not spilling over the ethnic conflict. Does Russia has an ideology, something to match Prometheism? I think for the very long period of time, the current regime did not have an ideology to really lean on. We know that Putin started as a liberal, and then slowly he emerged to be more moderate, but by his third term, when he came back in 2012, he became very openly conservative, anti-Western, and therefore relying on the very conservative Russian elements. But even then, I think it's only with the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russians started to formulate and push forward the idea of a Russian civilization. So that means that they are working on developing a kind of a more consistent ideology that concerns, that describes who they are, where they're going, what are their goals, that will become an instrument of the soft power. Just today, I read an article about basically a statement of one of the State Duma deputies, Fedorov, about how Russian language should be the basis for the identification of being Russian. That is very similar to what the Soviet Union was doing. So they are looking for something that can unite all people who are diverse by all like religion, ethnic background, but who will be united by just speaking the Russian. And therefore, if you speak the Russian, therefore you are Russian. And therefore, it's a cultural, linguistic identification with the Russian civilization. So therefore, I think they are moving in this direction, and the ideological kind of transformation. Of course, it is already happening, but the doctrine is not, I think, fully developed yet. So these are my very brief responses on. I want to leave some space for the Q&A, but I will briefly say very briefly about the main criticism from the modern political philosophy of how the Prometheism, neo-Prometheism might be accepted in some of the now Western, I'm not talking about Western political science, but also maybe global, actually, the global responses to this, because they might be even more interesting. Since the decolonization rhetoric, and I'll talk only about one aspect, this decolonization rhetoric becoming so prominent in the discourses of political theory, one aspect of Prometheism that can be criticized is from this idea that Prometheus should be born inside their communities. You cannot import the heroes. You cannot import the institutions, policies, and therefore we should give agencies to all these people who are under some sort of empires and who cannot realize their national potential to develop it on their own. So it's recognizing their agency and having them formulate what is just on their own. With this, I just wanted to quickly end and see if we have any questions. Thank you so much.
Olga, thank you. Thank you very much. I do have a follow-up question to you, but for that, I would like to follow up with Marcel. Marcel, can you say, in the context of this emerging ideology that Olga has proposed, has been kind of articulated by the Kremlin and Putin in particular, what are some of the current doctrines or strategies that Poland is pursuing that reflect Prometheism or neo-Prometheism? I mean, just the fact that I saw that member of the Polish Parliament, Paweł Kowal, he brought a portrait, or he brought a portrait of Giedroyć, and it is currently in one of the rooms of the Sejm, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, in one of its rooms, and he's chairman of that committee. That does suggest some continuity, or at least some intellectual base that the current Polish government is looking to continue. Can you touch a little bit on that, and then refer to how this is, or maybe may not be, on a crash course with the ideology that is taking root in Russia, or that has always been there, but maybe now is being articulated in a different way?
Well, thank you, Maciej, for that question. So when I think about the official policy of the Polish state, clearly the military aid to Ukraine is a big part of that. But really, since 2008, there's been Polish support for post-Soviet countries, I think starting with Georgia, really, which was one of the first cases in which Putin was promoting a kind of a cross-border ethnic separatism, in the cases of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And then he would, of course, later do it with the ethnic Russians in the Donbass and in Crimea in 2014. I get the impression that the Polish state, not just in terms of the foreign policy, but in terms of drawing people to the country educationally, or sort of building networks with people who are exiles from countries under attack by Russia over the last decade or two. That has really emphasized the idea that Poland is not just one nation state among many, but it is still a part of this post-Imperial Russian and post-Soviet space. And I think that's interesting, because when I look at the 90s, especially when Russia was quite fragmented under Yeltsin, maybe the emphasis was more on Poland just integrating with Central and Western Europe, but now I think there's more of a sense that Poland has a tie to these countries that have historically been in that fold. And for me, that's a direct response to Putin's attempts at rehabilitating Russian imperial imagery and ideologies. Olga was talking about this already, and I think I would add to that just Putin's argument about Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Russians being one pan-national community. That's been resisted a great deal, and I think the Polish state right now is certainly challenging that narrative. I don't know, in terms of the actual degree of support for these ideas, advanced by the post-Russia movement, to what extent that's actually backed by people within the Polish government, and I would like to find out, more about that. But definitely outside of the state itself, there are a lot of civil society and kind of NGO ecologies developing that seek to establish Poland as an alternate point of interaction, I think, for people from the post-Soviet space more generally.
Thank you, Marcel. The most interesting thing that I've found with neo-Prometheism is how it almost seamlessly went from an intellectual concept into policy, into a doctrine, ahead of its time in the 70s, and then accepted by the generation of Solidarity, and then after '89 becoming policy of the government, and then transcending these various governments that came to power from the left to the right. And it was always the idea that Poland is in that national interest. That's why I refer to neo-Prometheism. So it's very realistic. It is Poland's security is tied directly to the security and independence of these former captive nations. But if we looked at certain elements of the continuity of that doctrine, Olga, can you tell us on the other hand, why it would? Can you offer some of the criticisms in terms of maybe there are instances where you say that the element of agency is important, because neo-Prometheism might imply that the path for your independence is to the West. It is that integration with the EU and NATO. Many of these countries have voiced their support for that Western integration within the European structures and the Euro-Atlantic community, whether it's Ukraine or Georgia. But maybe some parts of today's Russian Federation, if we are thinking about a potential rupture in the future. Again, I mentioned that neo-Prometheism, they were thinking in the 70s where it took 2 more decades. So if one lesson that we could take from that is to think a decade, 2 decades, right? I mean, we know that Putin won't live forever. I don't want you to make any very, very predictions, but just considering the various trends that are taking place in Russia, and whether it is that relationship between making sure that the peripheries of the center are satisfied in that client, right, patron relationship, that they are still that the fruits of that centralized flow of resources, right, information, that they don't have any interest to break away from the center. Can you tell us some of those trends, how Russia or how the Kremlin is countering, these potential efforts to move away from the center?
So yes, I think, I will answer you. Again, I'm not a very big scholar on political philosophy. I will tell you about the structural responses, what is done. So first of all, isolation by itself is a strategy to keep all the Prometheanism away from Russia. So it's closing the border, and in this regard, Western countries closing the border is also to Russia is also helping, because that sort of a way a lot of the civil society agents do not come to Russia to promote the Western lifestyles. So it's one of the ways isolation is always a kind of a strategy for societies to protect the regime, or not for societies, for the states to protect the existing regime. And that's clearly there. Second of all, rerouting the economy and rerouting the trade is also one of the ways that we move away from the West. We know where the Prometheum is coming from that can shatter the sort of the integrity of the Russian Federation, and therefore moving away from trading even with the West. Even if it still occurs, it occurs through the third parties now, obviously, given the sanctions. But that means that that helps Russia to maintain its sort of, if not full, kind of autonomy economically from the West, but really limit this dependency or shrunk this dependency. So all of that is actually very big structural conditions for essentially consolidating the power of the regime. It becomes much harder to penetrate Russia with for civil society groups who could even spread these ideas, but also for the Russian citizens to establish credible connections in these with the Western partners, for example. In terms of the criticism, you also you mentioned that what Prometheism is offering is empowerment through first understanding that you are short of self-determination, and therefore you should seek your way of realizing your potential as an ethnic group or as a region, because the maps that I have seen is not really ethnic maps of Russia, it's for regional maps of Russia. And therefore that can somehow also be not quite possible to realize, at least in the current conditions. It's just because Siberia, it is a donor of resources, but it really requires a lot of things to be produced somewhere else and brought to it. So it's very easy to, from the supply side, to control Siberia because it doesn't produce stuff that could make it autonomous and not dependent on other states for just sustainability of its economies. So therefore, and it's also very sparsely populated. The people who are now working in the mine fields, in the oil fields or mines, they're not even living there. They live there temporarily. These are kind of like shift workers. They come and go. So therefore, the southern Siberia is the belt where most of the population is concentrated, and therefore the demography does not say that these people would feel empowered on their own. Essentially, what this suggests, this is sort of like, okay, this will be the if it dissolves, it will be all these regions that wouldn't be economically sustainable, and therefore, why would they do it to begin with? So I think the strategy for Prometheanism in these conditions should be not to dissolve Russia, and that is my final word, not to dissolve the Russian Federation, but to create tools for empowering these regions for becoming a true federation in which they can realize their potential through more healthy relationship in a more democratic state with the center, where they could still enjoy the big market, the diverse market, but at the same time, because I mean, really, we are in the waters of of regional economies, and therefore it's very, in my mind, difficult to imagine that they would thrive, even if they are ethnically or regionally independent, that they would thrive economically, and that's, they would fall apart again. Like this is not sustainable. So they will fall under the some sort of a I don't know, dictatorial or some other rule again. So they won't be able to maintain independence if these things are not taken into consideration. So thank you.
Olga, thank you so much for those points, and Marcel, thank you for explaining Prometheism, and then how we tied that into today's Kremlin, today's thinking in the Kremlin, and I can just conclude that some of these forces in international relations, they are very difficult to predict, and again, something that was unthinkable in the 1970s became real in '89 and then '91. So I guess the future of the Russian Federation, given the various things that Olga mentioned, it is very difficult to tell how the makeup of that state will look like in the coming years. But definitely I just want to end on the point that the terrible loss of life in Ukraine and the brutal attack against that sovereign nation by Russia is definitely a force that will have tremendous consequences on the makeup of that state and on its relations with its closest neighbors, including Poland, and also the international community and partners or states that used to be partners, right, of Russia. So thank you again. Unfortunately we are out of time, but I wanted to thank you again. Thank the Kościuszko Foundation for allowing to have us for inviting us to this webinar, to this conversation in the panel. We look forward to future events hosted by the Kościuszko Foundation. And again, thank you to all the participants. We had a very large crowd. I was moving between the Q&A, and some questions were here, but I'm sorry, we didn't have time to get to them today. But thank you again, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Maciej and Olga and Marcel, very much for this fascinating discussion, for introducing, explaining, and elaborating on the concept of Prometheism. Perhaps since Ukraine was discussed today, to those of you who are joining us today for the first time and you're learning about the foundation because of this webinar, I should add that it was 2-3 days after the start of the war in Ukraine when the foundation also started a fundraising campaign. And since then, we managed to raise over $1.8 million to help Ukrainian people. First, this help was distributed towards humanitarian aid, and then for a variety of educational programs that assisted and continue to assist Ukrainian scholars, students, and children. The foundation also started collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution to protect cultural heritage in Ukraine. I just want to say that the Ukraine Fund is still on. Our programs to support Ukrainian people are also still on. So if you would wish to support and contribute towards this fund, by all means, please do. And the very last note, an announcement, the next episode in the Foundation's webinar series will be about Polish Americans. Dr. Dominik Stecuła of the Colorado State University will share his insights from his book titled Polish Americans Today, offering the most detailed empirical look at Polish American community, its politics, demographics, identities, and cultural activities. This webinar will happen on February 22nd, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you are interested, please mark your calendars. All relevant information, including registration link, is on the Kościuszko Foundation's website. And with that note, I would like to conclude our webinar today, wishing you all a great rest of the day or evening. Thank you all very much.